Good morning. My name is Emmie Seaman. My pronouns are she and her. And as you've already figured out, my talk this morning is on our sixth principle, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The world is full of genocide, abuse, terror, and war. Luna, may we start the images? George Floyd, murdered by a police officer in Minneapolis in 2020. Afghan women before the Taliban took control and after. Furthermore, their economy has no cash to pay salaries or to buy food. They face malnutrition and starvation in the coming months. Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi dissident, journalist, and columnist for the Washington Post, assassinated in 2018. Forest fires in Spain, France, and the Western United States. School shootings, war and survival in Syria and Ukraine. I repeat, the sixth principle is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The goal of world community with peace and justice and freedom for all may be an uphill battle. It may not be attainable. It may be an impossible dream. And yet we cannot give up without trying. We lose the opportunity to do what we know is right. We lose the chance to put our principles to work to create more peace and more freedom and more justice in the world. We may forfeit the prospect of some peace if we insist on a perfect peace. Gustav Flaubert once said, "Perfection is the enemy of the good." We unwittingly make ourselves enemies of the good if we insist on a perfect success. We see wars start and stop. We see civil rights marches. We see government change policy and people change culture. Most of these end in defeat. What have we gotten ourselves into by stating a goal of world peace, a community with peace, liberty, and justice for all? And how do we cope? As naive or impossible as the sixth principle may seem, I'm not willing to give up on it. I want us to believe and live as we believe that world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all is possible. As Sean Parker Dennison says, there is no guarantee that we will succeed, but you may be assured that we will improve ourselves and improve the world by trying. I just finished reading a book by Patrick Taylor, written about doctors in Ireland in the 1930s. It's a novel, but it's based on his experiences and his knowledge, in which he writes, change a little corner of the world, helping people have sanitation, clean drinking water, and get vaccinated. That's in the 1930s. And here it is, 2022, over 80 years later. He's writing about Ireland then, and he could be writing about us right now today. So the big question is, what can we do to help create a community of peace, freedom, and justice? What's wrong with starting right here at home? I can list a few ideas. Perhaps you're already participating in some of them. Maybe you have other ideas of your own. But we can support organizations, and I'm sure many of you do, such as the NAACP, Planned Parenthood, the ACLU, Doctors Without Borders. That's just to name a few. not to mention the organizations that are helping Ukraine right now. We can join protests if you're willing and able. Your body adds one more to the count. 1,000 people protesting an issue makes a much bigger statement than just 10. I lived in Washington, D.C. I lived in Washington, D.C. in 1989 during when we had the NOW rally, Women's Lives, Women's Equality. There was an estimated 300,000 participants, including me. That's a lot of people marching to the Capitol. 300,000 makes an impression, doesn't it? One can donate money to worthy causes if one can afford it. And I believe giving locally is just as important as giving internationally. Then let's talk about small things that individuals might do. In the scope of worldwide events, these are just tiny little things, and yet they can add up to so much to us individually or collectively. For a couple of things that have happened to me, on June 22nd this year, my horoscope said, maybe kindness alone can evaporate the evil of the world, but it may stop some from developing. It's like the universe was telling me that day I had to prepare for this talk. So let me share a few experiences that I've had in June. You heard my joy and joys and concerns when I told about the young girl who walked up to me, handed me a bouquet, and said, "These are for you. Have a nice day." Then she smiled and walked away. The flowers lasted for a week on the dining room table, and every time I walked by, I got a glow. In fact, telling you about it right now gives me a glow. Made me feel good all over. A few years ago, I participated in a workshop when each person was asked to tell of an act of kindness he or she had performed. Well, I could remember a few, but I said instead of specifying a particular act, which seemed a little egotistical, there have been times when I've said something to someone. I don't even remember what it was, but much later, maybe even years later, that person said to me, whatever I said to her or him said, that really affected my life. It made me change directions. It made me do something more positive. Little do we know how our actions or words can speak volumes to others' ears. Think yourselves. Think of an act of kindness that you have performed or received, large or small. Here's an example I've found when I'm checking out at the grocery store. The clerk always asks, "How are you?" And I always reply, "Fine. How are you?" Usually takes them by surprise. And it's amazing the answers that I get. Sometimes it even starts a conversation. Could be about anything. Elizabeth Gilbert wrote a story in O magazine about being stuck in a New York bus on a cold, wet, miserable day. She tells that the bus was filled with cold, tired, and irritable people. 2 men barking at each other over a shoving match, and a pregnant woman who got on the bus and no one offered her a seat. The exasperated bus driver stopped his bus, got on the intercom, and announced to the passengers that he was aware of their tiredness and their frustration, but he could do nothing about the traffic or the weather. And then he said, "Here's what I can do. As you leave the bus, I will extend my hand, and you put your troubles in my hand as you exit. The route runs along the river, and when I get to the end of the route, I'll throw all your problems into the river." He started up the bus, continued on to the next stop. He stopped. He held out his hand, and as each passenger exited, they mimed putting their problems into his hand. They continued on at each stop, and as it continued, people were watching. They began watching each other. and then we were smiling. And finally, they were laughing. The bus driver kept his word, and when he reached to the end of his route, he stopped, opened the window, and threw all the troubles into the river. My point is, when the grocery store clerk asked, "How are you?" someone cared enough to ask back, "And how are you?" And the bus driver was a light that as an illumination in a dark situation. The bus driver was just an ordinary man, and I'm just an old woman buying groceries. But he and I have real power to benefit others. We all live in struggles at one time or another. When life feels grim and feels powerless in the face of world troubles, ask yourself, what can I do right now to be a light? Of course, you can't solve global warming or stop wars, but you can influence people that you brush up against, even if you don't know each other's names. You never know how much pain another person may be experiencing. So lighten up your interaction with others. I've lost my last page. Here we go. Elizabeth finished her essay by saying, no matter who you are, or where you are, or how mundane, or how tough your situation may seem, you can illuminate the world. In fact, this is the only way the world will ever be illuminated, one bright act of grace at a time, all the way to the river. Intuition, compassion, good intent, these essences of love are all we have. Energies that have no end pass silently onward, much further than we can imagine. It's tempting to turn off the noise, the barrage of words day after day, the unfathomable acts of others. But we cannot turn aside. We must speak. We must write. We must act to make a world that's not so scared, so mistrustful, or so unforgiving. Now I want to show you some positive images. Environmental cleanup, a pro-choice protest, Black Lives Matter protest, charitable donations, helping homeless, gay pride parade, simply helping a neighbor. And last, the height of optimism, mowing grass in Ukraine with shelled out buildings in the background. Let us go forth with this man through a door of hope for the future. A world community of peace, liberty, and justice for all isn't going to happen in my lifetime, my children's, or my grandchildren's. But a spark of goodness starts with all of us right now. Even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go crazy, I'd still plant my flowers. Thank you.